Good morning, everyone. My name is Gad Lebanon, and I'm Chief Economist North America here at the Conference Board. And welcome to a special webcast on solutions to the labor shortages problem. As you know, that's a topic that we've been following and studying for several years now. And it's time for us not just to tell you that there is a labor shortage problem, but what you could or should be doing about it. But before we get to that, I wanted to give you some, well, actually, let me tell you what the main questions that we're going to deal with before we get to the webcast tips. So we'll focus on several main questions. One is we now have labor market shortages, as I mentioned earlier, and organizations, the essence of the labor market shortages is organizations that are struggling to recruit and retain workers. What we did in order to help those companies is we conducted a survey of many solutions. We asked a lot of questions, and over 200 respondents braved through this survey and went through over exactly 59 solutions that we asked them about. So we are going to hear today about those solutions and also other impacts that or things that companies are going through as a result of the labor shortages. You're welcome to ask us questions at any time during the webcast. No need to wait until the end. If you just type the question at the box. And you can also earn credits for this webcast. You need to stay online for the entire webcast, and a credit is available for live participation only. You can get 3 types of credits here: HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. So you see here the instructions for each of them. Together with me are my co-writers of the report and partners in this project. First on my right, Robin Eriksson. She is a principal researcher at the Human Capital team here at the Conference Board, working with me and the labor market team. So welcome, Robin. It's also your first webcast in this studio.
Correct. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Gad.
Good. And together with Robin and me is Elizabeth Crowfoot, a senior economist here at the Conference Board, and also she's been on several webcasts in the past. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So what we're going to talk about, briefly start for those of you who didn't follow our work in recent years, just a basic update of what's happening in terms of the labor shortages problem here at the Conference Board. We're going to talk about the solutions project and the survey, how we went about doing this. And the majority of this webcast is about preliminary survey insights. As I said, we asked a lot about, most of it about the solutions to labor shortages, but also some outcomes, how companies were impacted by the labor shortages. And throughout this presentation, we're going to separate between blue-collar and white-collar solutions because it turns out to be very different. Not every solution that is suited for blue-collar is also suited for white-collar workers and vice versa. And again, please don't hesitate. If you have any questions, just type it and we will get back to you. So a little about the labor shortages problem. So in 2019, or right now, we have historically high levels of labor market tightness. The unemployment rate is at a 50-year low, and the labor market is especially tight for blue-collar and low-paid services jobs, which is the exact opposite of the trend we had in recent decades, where the labor market for highly educated white-collar workers was tighter. And there are various reasons for that, and we wrote reports about that, but that's the reality, that perhaps surprisingly, it's the people at the lower end of the wage distribution that are feeling most of the tightness right now. As I said, the essence of a tight labor market is it's harder to recruit and harder to retain workers. Time to fill positions is at a historical high, and as a result, as you'll see, a lot of companies are operating with unfilled positions. When it's harder to recruit and retain, and when more and more of the people are already have a job, hiring new workers is an issue from a quality perspective, and there is a growing concern about labor quality, especially in blue-collar and low-paid services. When it's harder to recruit and harder to retain, and companies want to get higher quality workers, it's not surprising that we are seeing faster wage growth in the US. And again, we are seeing it more visibly for the blue-collar and low-paid services. From a company perspective, we think the main impact beyond just the impact on the HR department and the business units in terms of hiring and retention is that it will have an impact on the bottom line of many companies. We expect in 2019 to see a squeeze on corporate profits. On the one hand, we are experiencing a modest economic slowdown, meaning that revenues are growing more slowly, and at the same time, labor costs are growing more rapidly, so corporate profits are being squeezed from both ways. In that environment, since a lot of CEOs don't like seeing their corporate profits declining, there is an added pressure on HR departments and talent acquisition teams to hire and retain workers and provide the resources needed for the business units. And companies are reacting to that, and this is most of what we're going to talk about. And as more evidence that this is top of mind for many companies, this is a slide from our CEO Challenge survey, one of our flagship reports, where we asked CEOs and C-suite members of their main hot button issues and concerns. And the number one hot button issue in every part of the world is attraction and retention of top talent. So this is a major issue for companies. Just a little more on how difficult it is to recruit and find qualified workers. In this chart, we have two measures from the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business. The blue line is the percent of businesses who, in the monthly survey that the NFIB conducts, say they have few or no qualified applicants for job openings. The red line are firms with positions that they are not able to fill right now. And you see that both of them are at the highest level ever, meaning that it is extremely hard for those businesses to find qualified workers. As I said, when it's harder to recruit and harder to retain, companies often compromise on the quality of the workers they hire, but it's not a free lunch. What we see here is that this is in the same survey, the NFIB. Every month, the NFIB asks, what is your most important problem? And there are a bunch of options. One of the options is quality of labor as the biggest problem. And we now see that this is at the highest level it's been, and higher than also any other option. So this is the main concern companies in the NFIB have, that the quality of labor is creating a problem for their businesses. And again, when it comes to wages, the difficulties in retaining and recruiting eventually shows up in wages. So here, this is from the Employment Cost Index, which is, according to the government, the most reliable measure of changes in wages over time. We divided the economy here to two groups. The red line are management professional and related. So that's close to 40% of employment, and most of the high earners are in that group. We see that group, we see some acceleration over this expansion, but still at about 2.5%, wage growth now is still well below where it was before the recession. However, if we look at the blue line, which is all other occupations, so mostly occupations with workers without a BA degree, there we see a much more visible acceleration in wages to the point that it's above already pre-recession wage growth. And there are various reasons why we see that. Part of it has to do simply because there are a lot of retirements now, a lot of baby boomers retiring, and baby boomers have a disproportional number of workers without a BA degree, people in a lot of those skilled trade and blue-collar occupations. So there are a lot of retirements. On the other hand, relatively few people want to go to those positions. The percent of graduates that have, of young people that have a BA degree is growing, and since the recession, growing rapidly. And people with a BA do not want to work in blue-collar and low-paid services. So the supply of workers to those jobs is shrinking, actually, supply of workers. At the same time, there is growing demand for those workers. Some of the automation that took place in recent decades is no longer replacing workers with technology. And at the same time, we have an important trend of a huge increase in the number of drivers. The spread of e-commerce significantly increases the number of delivery drivers and truck drivers, and that is responsible for about half of the growth in blue-collar workers in recent years. So on the one hand, we have fewer people who are willing to work in those jobs. On the other hand, the demand for those jobs is increasing, and that's why we have a shortage, especially in those workers, which is likely to continue in the next decade. So, so this is the problem. It's a big problem. I don't think, with the baby boomers retiring through 2030, this problem, if anything, is going to get worse before it gets better. And the companies can't just hope that this problem will go away. So you need to do something. And that's why we're here, to tell you what other companies are doing and perhaps what you should be doing. Let me pass it to Elizabeth to tell us a little about the survey that we did.
Sure. Thank you, Gad. So we wanted to give you a bit of background behind the motivation and the approach that we're taking with this study. So the Conference Board has been studying and predicting labor shortages for the past 5 years. But we're done predicting, and we know that they're here, as Gad has walked us through all that data. And so in order to help our members and some of the public at large, we've embarked on this project to identify some of the best practices that companies are using right now to solve this problem. And our report is going to be published in September of this year. In terms of our methodology, we started with the literature review of case studies and other media coverage of companies addressing the labor shortage problem and what they're actually doing. For example, we've heard about the trucking industry and all of the problems that they're having finding truck drivers. And one solution that we've heard about is trucking companies focusing on women, so a demographic that's not traditionally involved in that occupation. So really going out of traditional occupational norms for that particular job. Another example is Walmart implementing a new education program for their associates in order to increase their retention. So all of these case studies and what we heard in the media served as the basis of the solutions and the options that we included in the survey that our respondents saw. And in today's discussion, we're going to focus on the results of this survey, some of the preliminary findings. And then after this, the next step is to really dig into some of those respondents' experiences, follow up with some interviews, and dig into, how are they really approaching this problem, and especially those that may have said that they're not really seeing recruitment or retention difficulties. What are they doing that other companies are not doing, and what can we learn from them? So in terms of the number of respondents, we had 225 participants, and this slide here gives you a sense of the demographics behind really the industrial breakdown of our respondents. You can see that participation was more heavily weighted towards the service industries rather than other industries. So, for example, on the left-hand side of the chart, you see government and public administration and nonprofits. You see business, consulting, and professional services, financial, insurance, and real estate, also healthcare, computer, and IT. So those are really the industries that are represented that represent most of our respondents. And on the other side of the graph, you see other industries such as construction, agriculture, mining, utilities, and energy, which are much smaller proportion. So that's important to take into account when we're interpreting the results of who is actually being represented in this study. Another way that we looked at who responded to our survey was in terms of the size of the company, both by revenue and by number of employees. And what we did here is to segment the participants into 4 different groups, into small and medium-sized firms, mid-market firms, and then 2 tiers of large enterprises. In terms of revenue, you see that large enterprises with greater than $1 billion in revenue made up the majority of our respondents. So about 65% total if you add up those 2 large enterprise bars in terms of revenue. And it's a similar story in terms of U.S. headcount. You have about 78% of our respondents that were large enterprises with over 1,000 employees. So as Gad was saying earlier, we felt it was really important to look at the different solutions by type of worker. So we segmented out blue-collar and white-collar workers in the survey. And just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I wanted to walk through these definitions. In terms of the blue-collar definition, it's important to point out that it does include low-paying services occupations as well. So this group includes construction, extraction, farming, installation, maintenance, repair, production, transportation, and material moving occupations, as well as low-paying services such as healthcare support, protective service, food preparation and serving, building and grounds cleaning, and personal care and service occupations. And then the white-collar occupations include management, business, financial, and professional occupations that generally require at least a bachelor's degree, as well as jobs that require less education, such as sales, office, and administrative support occupations. So we just want to get those out of the way to make sure we understand how to interpret our results. So we did ask our respondents in the survey, what is your general distribution of workers in your company? And most of our respondents lean slightly toward white-collar workers at about 48%. We had 31% that were mostly blue-collar, that their workers were mostly blue-collar, and then about 21% that were about half and half. So now we can jump into some of our survey insights.
But first we have, before we tell you what we found, we want to hear you. So we have a polling question here, the first of several. So is your organization experiencing difficulties recruiting and or retaining workers? So there are 5 options here: difficulty recruiting, difficulty retaining, difficulty both recruiting and retaining. So if you have both, just choose this one. Not having difficulty either recruiting or retaining, and you do not know. That's the final option. So it'll give you a few more seconds to make up your mind. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's close the survey. So 55% of you have both recruiting and retaining difficulties. 16% of you have recruiting difficulties. So that means that together, if you about 70% of you have recruiting difficulties. If we add up the 54 and 12%, that's 66% of you have difficulty retaining. Only 8% do not have recruiting or retaining difficulties, and 10% of you are not sure or don't know. So this actually matches our results pretty closely from the survey. And any initial reactions?
I wasn't surprised by the responses simply because some other research has shown that as unemployment goes down in this country, voluntary turnover goes up, and it's an exact X, and so you can think of it. So I'm not surprised at all that 70% of the respondents have issues with recruiting and retaining.
Yeah, and that's 2019. Probably if we did this survey in 2009, the results would have been much different. So let's see what we asked exactly the same question in the survey. So Elizabeth, what did the survey show?
Well, the survey, let me change the slide here, almost exactly the same result actually in terms of the recruiting difficulty. But let's segment this out first. So if you look at the black segment of the pie chart, we had 28% of respondents that said they had difficulty only recruiting. On the opposite of the pie chart, you see that only 6% had difficulty only retaining, and then 42% had difficulty both recruiting and retaining. So if you add up all of those three segments, you see that about 76% of our respondents had some difficulty in this area. And then adding up the black pie segment with the lightest blue segment gives you about 70%, which is exactly what we saw here today, that are experiencing recruiting difficulty. So we do see that most of the challenge is in recruiting compared to the retention portion of the challenge was only about 48% in this, according to our respondents. So again, recruiting is really the main message here, that's where the main problem is. And it's noteworthy that 20% said they aren't having either difficulty recruiting or retaining, which was a little bit higher than I would have expected. So that was a surprise to me. So we'll definitely want to dig into those companies and see what they're doing to address this or how they're circumventing the problem.
Or perhaps it's a result of the industry or the location they operate in, which is not... I should, from a methodological perspective, we should say that for the rest of the survey, we are taking out, we didn't allow the people who said they don't have difficulty recruiting or retaining, or they didn't know to answer the other questions. So all the other questions about the outcomes and about the solutions are just for people who have a retention or recruiting difficulties, because we wanted the response to be as a result of the recruiting or retention difficulties.
Right. Thank you, Gad, for that clarification. So we also asked our companies or our respondents, how satisfied are you with the performance and or contributions of the workers hired in the past 12 months? And in this chart, the white bars represent white-collar workers and the blue bars represent blue-collar workers. And you can see that there's quite a bit of satisfaction among the white-collar of employers for their white-collar hires, about 70%, and that's compared to less than 50% that are satisfied with their blue-collar hires. And then you couple that result with the fact that we're seeing that blue employers are more dissatisfied with their blue-collar workers than with their white-collar workers. So this worker quality issue is coming up again here, and you can see that it's perhaps more, companies are seeing more worker quality issues with the blue-collar rather than with white-collar if you couple this information together on the satisfaction and dissatisfaction. We also asked our respondents if they had increased investment in new technologies, for example, automation or artificial intelligence, with the specific intent to reduce their staffing needs. And you can see that about 40% of both respondents that are hiring blue and white collar workers said that yes, they are starting to implement these new technologies. But also there's a significant portion that isn't doing this yet. Over 40% for blue collar workers and nearly 50% for respondents hiring white collar workers. So this might indicate that there's still room for increased automation in order to address some of these labor shortage problems. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Or it could also be that the implementation phase of the technologies is still going on within these companies, and we just haven't seen the effects of that automation take place, or the companies haven't reached a point where they really can substitute one for the other as easily. That takes us to another poll question.
Yeah, so we have another poll question, and this is about the outcomes of the recruiting and retention difficulties. Which of the following outcome has happened most frequently in your company as a result of recruitment and or retention difficulties? We have several options here: increased employee attrition, operating with unfilled positions, lowered morale and employee engagement, lost institutional knowledge, increased employee workload or overtime. So there are probably other options, but among those 5, if you had to choose the one that's happening most frequently, which one would you choose? Again, give you a few more seconds to, I see still the results bumping around, but we have to close the survey at some point. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, survey closed. Okay, so almost 50% said that operating with unfilled position was their most frequent problem. The second, increased employee workload or overtime. The third highest option, but well below the previous 2, is lowered morale and employee engagement. The loss of institutional knowledge also is 7% of the respondents, and increased employee attrition is only 4% of the respondents. Robin, Elizabeth, any initial thoughts on those responses?
Well, this seems to correspond directly with the results of our survey. So those top 3 results match the top 3 that our respondents said. So it's very much in line, and I'm not surprised if you're having difficulty recruiting and retaining, you're going to have unfilled positions. So that's unfortunately one of the consequences of not finding the right people.
Right. Yeah. 3/4 chose either operating with unfilled positions or increased employee workload, which is very related to that. So it seems like the main problem is simply having enough bodies at the organization in this time. We have a few questions. We see a lot of questions. We may not be able to answer every question immediately, but here is there data on breakdown on white collar and blue collar workers? We have a very low number of blue collar workers, so we would be skewing. So what we're going to show you in this result is the overall. Therefore, when you look separately at blue collar, at white collar, it's more important to look at the rankings within each group rather than compare the number for blue collar and white collar moving forward in the coming survey. We do have the question about, is your company mostly blue collar, white collar, or both? So later on we will look at the results by the responding company. And there's also a question here about the breakdown by industry, and we will again provide it. So this is just, we just recently closed the survey. We're planning to, I should have said it earlier, we are coming out with a big report on this topic in September. and by then we will do a thorough analysis of the results. This is kind of a first look at the results, and we will provide interesting stories by industries and other breakdowns. Okay, so Elizabeth, you want to talk to us a little about what the survey, when we gave them more options in the outcomes and what the distribution showed there?
Right, we really felt that it was important to dig into some of these business outcomes or implications of recruitment and retention difficulties. And like I said, the top three in our poll today match exactly with the top three of our respondents. So first, operating with unfilled positions. Approximately 90% of those with recruitment difficulties said that they had this challenge, and almost 80% of those with retention difficulties. Increased employee workload and overtime also very high, as well as lower morale and employee engagement. Increased employee attrition and lost institutional knowledge were also very high amongst those that were suffering from retention difficulties. A few other of the categories that we put in the survey: decreased candidate conversion rate and candidates ghosting interviews. Those are two that are particularly associated with recruitment difficulties, and it is troubling that almost 30% of our respondents said that some of their interview candidates were just not showing up. So that really speaks to the difficulty that employers are experiencing out in the job market today. And a few others, negative impact on innovation and product development is also over 20% in both categories. Lower output or turning down business, also 20 to 25%. And what was surprising to me was how low we saw measurable adverse impact on profitability and higher prices on the company products or services. That really speaks to me that companies may not be measuring the impact that recruiting and retention difficulties are having on the bottom line. And not only that, they seem to be shouldering that cost or that burden and not passing it on to consumers, for good or bad. But it just shows that perhaps they're not gauging that very well. And I don't know, Robin, if you want to speak further to that point, or.
Oh, I think it's very relevant from the perspective of employee burnout, mm-hmm. And that increased employee workload and the new focus, sort of new, on well-being. Organizations are having to deal with well-being. They're having to deal with issues around burnout because they're not passing on these costs mm-hmm. to their consumers.
That's a really good point. The well-being of the workers is also something that we need to take into consideration in these outcomes as well. And I think that takes us to the solutions portion.
So now, Robin, we're moving to the main part of the survey, what companies are actually doing about it. So
we actually start off, I think, with a poll.
Oh, right. We have
so basically, we have 59 solutions. We were very proud of that.
Yeah.
As Gad had mentioned earlier, he said he wanted to challenge anyone who could come up with additional solutions that we haven't covered. So if you think of something, in this webcast, we're probably only going to be able to talk about the most important solutions, and we're also going to talk about the least used, but we actually have available for you all 59 solutions. But before we show you results, we want to ask you a question. So if we can go to the next polling question. We'll see it in a minute. So the question is, which of the following is your top recruiting or retention strategy for white-collar workers? So again, we have 59 options, but here we are just asking you, showing you 5 options. One is improved and communicated employment brand, increased efforts to foster a thriving company culture, increased social media efforts, increased wage and salaries, and offer teleworking and or remote flexibility. So I see the results are still bouncing there, so we'll give you a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Let's close the survey. Okay, it's pretty evenly distributed this time. 37% said that the top strategy is the increased effort to foster a thriving company culture. If you have that, and then it's easier to retain and easier to recruit. The second most popular, improved and communicated employment brand. The third is offer teleworking or other remote flexibility at 16%, increased wages and salaries at 14%, increased social media efforts at 8%. So any initial reactions to those results?
So I'm not surprised to see improved and communicated employment brand. However, I am surprised to see increased wages or salaries second from the bottom. It seems as though perhaps that's not happening for our audience as much as it is other places. And we'll get into the top solutions in just a minute. But
yeah, well,
did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. In our survey, as you'll see in a minute, people were able to choose all that applies.
That's correct.
And here we force them to choose just one. So as you'll see, increased in wages and salaries is used in the large majority of companies, but it's perhaps, if you're forced to choose just one top strategy, this is not the one, and it's more related to make the company known to be a good place to work. If people had a gun to their head and they had to choose their top option, that would be it.
This may also be related to the generational focus in terms of the incoming workers who have placed a higher priority and more importance on things like employment brand or company brand and their working experience rather than their compensation. So I think that might also be reflected in these results as well.
So you mean that the ages of the people who responded to our survey are different to the people who are now in the audience? Maybe.
In terms of the generation, the recruitment, the focus or the demographic that is being recruited, that might be.
Yeah. Okay, so what are the actual results?
So let's get into the solutions then. I'm just going to go to the first slide. So the first slide we wanted to show you is the top solutions for recruiting blue-collar workers. However, the title is correct, that in our survey we found that raising wages and salaries is the most used solution for blue-collar and white-collar workers. Actually, not just for recruiting, but for retention as well. And so you will find that these slides look a lot very similar, the next 4 slides, if you only look at the top 5 or so responses. So I'm going to actually be pointing out some of the more interesting things, some of the more interesting solutions for each of these categories. So in terms of recruiting blue-collar workers, the most interesting solution comes sort of in the middle, contracted with staffing firms to fill positions and offering new perks and benefits. That's different than what organizations are doing for their white-collar workers. In addition, expanding the target recruitment demographic, as Elizabeth had mentioned, in terms of trucking, expanding their labor demographic to include more women. I think there's also more focus on how to pull in other labor pools, and we're hoping to do some research on that here at the conference board as well. And then you can see there toward the bottom, implementing new and advanced technologies. Elizabeth had mentioned that. Increased advertising to improve candidate attraction and improving working conditions. So those are the solutions that are unique to recruiting blue-collar workers. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the top solutions for recruiting white-collar workers. Again, the first 3 are the same as you saw for recruiting blue-collar workers. However, that option around teleworking comes in higher here. It's
2/3.
2/3, yep, it's down there. And the other thing that's very interesting is that offering stretch assignments, job rotations, and job shadowing. It's part of organizations who are trying to retain and recruit workers, is to provide white-collar workers more internal mobility and global mobility options. It's something that we call total talent mobility here at the conference board. Also, unique to the white collar workers are offered or increased signing bonuses, provided or expanded learning opportunities, increased work schedule flexibility, and increased recruitment at colleges and job fairs. So again, these are the unique solutions. There's 6 that are the 6 unique top solutions for recruiting white collar workers. But we don't want to lessen the importance of the top ones, right? Around increasing efforts to foster a thriving company culture, increasing social media, improving or communicating employment brand. That's going to help attract workers to your organization if your current employees are happy, and provided or expanded internal training programs and created more robust onboarding programs. So all of those are important. Just wanted to first point out the differences. So if we go to the next slide, we have the top solutions for retaining blue-collar workers. And here you can see that, again, the first 6 are the same as the solutions that we saw for recruiting. However, there were some differences in terms of retaining blue-collar workers. So specifically, contracting with a staffing firm to fill positions, that's about in the middle of the list. You can see that that is unique for retaining blue-collar workers. Next, implementing or improving employee engagement efforts. That's higher for blue-collar than it is for white-collar. I was actually surprised by that. Another 4 that are unique to retaining blue-collar workers, increased efforts to improve overall employee experience. That's similar to improving employee engagement efforts. Improving working conditions for blue-collar workers. That makes a lot of sense that that's there, as they're very concerned about health and safety. And then the last 2 are actually unique to retaining blue-collar workers, increasing the efforts to streamline boring or burdensome tasks, and increase the efforts to develop better managers. So if you're not already thinking about doing these things, these are some solutions you may want to think about. So if we go to the next slide, this is the 4th slide that looks like this. Apologies for having so many look the same, but again, offering teleworking or remote flexibility, it's the number 4 option here. That is unique for retaining white-collar workers. Then I thought it was interesting, investing in corporate social responsibility showed up for both white-collar and blue-collar, but it's higher for white-collar than it is for blue-collar. So perhaps the white-collar workers are more concerned with that. And then again, as I mentioned, in terms of internal mobility, offering stretch assignments, job rotations, and or job shadowing, that's unique to retaining white-collar workers, not for blue-collar. The next 3 are actually unique to retaining white-collar workers as well, providing or expanding online learning opportunities, increasing work schedule flexibility. I think that fits a lot with the remote flexibility. And then improving existing benefits. So if you're trying to keep your workers, it makes sense that you're trying to improve your existing benefits. I'm not sure why that didn't show up as one of the top solutions for blue-collar workers, but it's there. It just was not as high. So with that, I want to go on to some of the questions around what are the least used solutions, just to give you some ideas of things that you could do in your organization that are not being used as much. And the majority of the solutions that are less used for blue collar and white collar are the same, so I won't go into that. I'll just mention a couple. I'll mention the most important ones, and then I'll also mention some of the ones that are unique. So you can see here for a top solution that isn't being, or sorry, a least used solution is accepting alternate credentials, lowering requirements for skills and competencies. Or apparently organizations haven't been willing to do that as much. For their blue collar workers, it's just slightly lower for white collar workers. Lowering degree requirements, improving or increasing transparency of health and safety, moving operations to other parts of the US, lowered or eliminated drug background check requirements. I'm actually glad to see that at the bottom of the list of least used solutions. Offering moving cost compensations, that was different for blue collar workers. Apparently that's already being done for white collar workers. Moving operations to other countries for lower costs or labor availability, developing or improving talent mobility program externally, is not being used for blue-collar workers, again, perhaps for some of the reasons I mentioned before, and then hiring using an online labor platform. So the white-collar worker solutions that are the least used are very similar, except for the last three. Created apprentice programs, apparently that's not used as much in white-collar work. And then the last two around overtime, I think those aren't used as much in white-collar as well, with required employee overtime. And so those are the least used solutions for recruitment challenges. So if you're looking to think of some things that you could do that you may not be doing already, you might want to think about these.
And Robin, I would think that a lot of these can also be done in conjunction with another strategy.
Correct.
For example, lowering requirements or accepting alternate credentials with boosting your internal training program in order to sort of make up the difference between that.
Well, and actually one of the organizations that I recently spoke to said that they had a program to train their warehouse workers. And they actually allowed the warehouse workers to have a program in their own time in the evenings and to train them for more white-collar jobs. And I thought that was a great example of an organization trying to increase their ability to recruit into harder to fill positions.
No, I think the combination of the strategies is where you can really see the most bang for your buck.
Yes, definitely agree.
There was a question here that was answered by another person in the audience. So there's a question: in recruiting blue-collar workers, what would be some examples of new perks, benefits being offered? And there was an answer, probably better than one we could provide, is someone said we're offering online local college credits, on-site childcare option.
There's one that we didn't include.
That is one we did not include.
Yeah.
Congratulations, you've won a prize.
And also have an on-site healthcare service option.
We didn't have that either.
So that's thank you for both the question and the answer. There's also a question here about will the definition of blue collar be changing given artificial intelligence growth and the need for different skills? Probably, being a production worker 20 years ago is different than being a production worker today. So my guess is that over time, what is considered blue-collar work will become less manual and more technological. But at the moment, we still kind of use those definitions. I think one of the big difference between most blue-collar and most white-collar is the level of education that still remains high. So even production workers, for example, even though they do less manual labor, still most of them do not have a college degree, and so that's still a separator.
And when it comes to automation, I think it's important to keep in mind that you're not automating the entire job, you're automating pieces of a job. So 30% of the job, 50% of the job. There's always going to be some manual element to some of those production type jobs that will make the definition continue to be relevant, I think.
Right. And Robin, what about the least used solutions for retention challenges?
All right, this is the list of the less used solutions for retention challenges. And again, the lists are very similar. So don't want to go into all of them, but increased transparency of health and safety. I loved that making leaders and managers accountable for retention made a list because I wanted to talk about it. I really think that this is one of the best ways that organizations can solve that retention issue. Because let's face it, we've all worked for leaders who are not very good. And I think that if you look at your managers and see that one manager can't hold on to their employees, then perhaps that manager needs to be in more of an individual contributor role, or you need to think about providing additional training for your managers and leaders. And so definitely think that that's a good solution that should be used. In terms of the blue-collar workers, the solution that's not being used very often is conducting one-on-one stay interviews to determine potential incentives. And so I think that's a solution. Obviously, you can't meet everyone's expectations, but it is possible to speak to people and just see what would help them be more motivated to stay in your organization. It makes sense that developing or improving a talent mobility program externally is here. However, what we were trying to get at with this solution was that some organizations have actually found that it's useful to have a joint venture with another organization and move employees from one company to another for a short-term rotation, so to speak, and they can learn additional skills. So perhaps an organization might send some of their employees to a supplier to find out how the products are made on the other end, and vice versa. So just some interesting things to think about. The option I was probably the most surprised at under blue collar workers, the very last one, which means this is the least used solution overall for blue collar workers, is to provide new incentives to retain older workers in full or partial capacity. So that's definitely something that organizations should be thinking about. It's number 3 from the bottom on the list of white collar workers. I also laughed a little bit when I saw under the white collar workers, about midway down the list, you can see increased efforts to monitor and, if necessary, reduce employee workload. And I really think that that's a great solution to think about if you're trying to retain your workers. As we all saw, that most companies are working with unfilled positions. They're increasing the workload on their employees. This gets at that burnout issue that I was mentioning. But really important to monitor and think about your employee workload. Again, and the last 2 were unique here, but it makes sense that the white collar workers aren't thinking about overtime that much. So we also know that somebody out there is saying, that's really great, Robin. Thanks for sharing with us the top solutions and the bottom, but what about all of the solutions? So we've got you covered. We have 6 slides that look exactly the same, but they're not. And you'll have these if you want to download the PDF of the slides. We just wanted to let you know, here are the 59 solutions, and we've coded them for you. And so let me just quickly walk you through the coding. So you can see here, we have the complete list of 59 blue-collar recruitment and retention strategies. So we've put them all together. The light blue is for recruiting only, the companies that said they were having issues with recruiting only. The gray are for the companies that said they're having issues with retention only. And the white, which is obviously the majority, said they're having issues with both. So just want to point out, increasing wages or salaries is being used by 60.7% of the organizations who are having difficulties retaining or recruiting. Followed 10% later, increasing efforts to foster a thriving company culture, 45% at increasing social media efforts, and then basically the rest of the solutions start to clump together, obviously decreasing order, but there you have them. You can refer to these when you're thinking, well, what else can we do in our organization? And we will definitely be sure to talk about the additional solutions that were suggested by one of our workers, and then one of our respondents. Sorry, I've got workers on the brain. And then the last 3 slides here are white collar recruitment and retention strategies. So I won't go through those. It's the same coding, but I will turn it back over to Gad.
I did want to actually just make one comment on the least used strategies for both blue and white collar, being the online labor platforms. I mean, that's something that I think most of us think is a consumer type platform. You can hail a ride, you can get someone to come clean your house or hang your TV on your wall. But increasingly, businesses are using these online labor platforms as well. And it's not only hiring an app developer or a graphic designer, but it can be a whole host of occupations. And even for blue-collar occupations, there are now platforms dedicated. They're like online staffing platforms where you can get workers, for example. Amazon is using these actually quite intensively to staff their warehouses, especially during the holiday season when there's so much going on, so much volume of packages, they need additional workers. So just
another example, a global hotel chain is in one location trying out using Uber for housekeeping. That's what they're calling it internally. And they are literally telling people, whenever you want to do some housekeeping, let us know. And they send them to a variety of locations, not just one. But they found that the people who are doing the additional sort of side hustles are people who aren't actually housekeepers. They're people who didn't do housekeeping jobs and who just wanted to do it in a certain period of time.
And so these platforms really open up your recruitment demographic to a group of people that you may not even have thought about or that even wanted to take the job that you have available. So it's something to keep in mind and look into.
Definitely.
I wonder, there's an interesting question here about the least used solutions today. The question is, are you recommending that companies look at using these more versus less? So not necessarily. There are some solutions that are simply not a good idea for certain companies.
You mean like lowering or eliminating drug testing?
Well, this actually, we did hear it from some members that they wondered, if you're working in construction or you're a driver, you certainly don't want to be high at work. But it could be that in other, now especially when marijuana is decriminalized in many areas, maybe, and it's becoming more and more used, perhaps some companies in some office jobs, if you had, it perhaps could be relaxed a little. So it's not necessarily a bad idea. And some companies did choose it as something that they are doing. But I was thinking more of offering teleworking, let's say, if you are in construction. That's not something that you're going to do. So not every option here is something that you should necessarily use. But, I think a lot of you, we just wanted to present to you a lot of options and make you think. It's sometimes you've been operating for many years in a period of a relatively easy labor market, and this tight labor market is something new, and there are things that, solutions that take a little work and reorganization, but that you should consider in this time. For example, one thing that I was surprised that was not higher is the fact that both in blue collar and white collar, the option of trying to incentivize older workers to stay, I thought would be higher, but and more companies would be using it. We see it in Japan, in Europe. We see a very rapid increase in recent years in the participation rate of older workers. We see a little of it in the US, but not as much. Perhaps that's something that more companies should be thinking about. So,
can I just add one
sure,
thing, Gad?
Sure.
I also wanted just to add, some call centers have decided to actually allow their workers to work remotely and do more teleworking. So there are options that are available.
Yeah.
And just, there are ways to make things work. And so perhaps that might be something that could be added to the list of things that,
Right.
that the blue collar workers
Yeah, no, absolutely.
have available.
So we are almost at the end of our time. Again, this is an initial look. We will have more communication and material about the survey and in general about solution to labor shortages. Most of them will be available in our September report. In the meantime, we really hope to hear from you. If you have suggestions or ideas for other solutions, please write to us. You see here on the slide here, there are other related content that webcast and reports that you are welcome to look at. And there will be a brief evaluation form at the end of this webcast. We would like to hear what you thought and how we can make our future webcast better. So I want to thank Robin and Elizabeth for being here with me and delivering this very interesting survey results. And thank you everyone for being with us, and have a good rest of the week.